So yesterday we were introduced to the Metta Bhavna, and in many ways it was an introduction to an old friend to all of us. I know that personally the Metta Bhavna was probably the practice that I took to the slowest. I absolutely loved the mindfulness of breathing and anything to do with mindfulness. Whereas the Metta Bhavna I found a much more difficult practice to do. And there were reasons for that. There was certainly a level of aversion, and that was something that I did have to work with over the years. And now, although my favorite go-to practice would still be the mindfulness practices, the Metta Bhavna is an extremely important practice in my life every day, as are the other Brahma Viharas in varying degrees. And the one thing that I would say about all of the Brahma Viharas, the four of them, these divine abodes, these unlimited capacities or places that we can move into. It's very difficult to actually unpack them individually because they do intertwine and interweave and interconnect in so many ways. I was thinking of them like a tapestry, the various threads of a tapestry, and when we look at the whole picture, we can see how beautiful it is. Whereas if we just take out one thread of the picture of the tapestry, it can be very difficult to see how it fits in with the others, and we may just see it as a piece of thread, whereas it's an intricate part of something much greater. So although I'll be trying to unpack Karuna, compassion, today, it will be interwoven with the other divine abodes that we will be looking at. And you may have noticed that too in what Maitrikaya was saying in his talk yesterday. He was talking about metta, about loving kindness, but very often it was overlapping into compassion and how the two of them do go hand in hand. And even in the reading and what we did with Green Tara last night, you saw how the two were very, very much interconnected. So as I speak about compassion, metta will be coming in as well this morning. So what is Karuna or compassion? Well, in and of itself, what it really is, from a Buddhist perspective, is that when metta meets up against dukkha, suffering, karuna or compassion spontaneously arises. It naturally will transform. So metta naturally will transform into compassion when we come up against dukkha, when we see it in ourselves as well as in others. Very often we think of compassion as being something that we should apply to other people, or perhaps that's just me. But certainly for a lot of my life, that is what I thought, was that it was something that I had to give to others, that I had to serve others. And certainly for me, I would forget myself in that equation, much to my detriment over time. And what we've been doing with the Metta Bhavna, it's one of the first practices you learn when you come to the center. So what we've been doing with that practice is that we've been learning and cultivating the ability to open our hearts to all living beings. And that includes ourselves. And if our hearts are open, what happens is that we become open to and part of and more aware of the interconnectedness of all living beings. There's a flow of connection. And when there's that flow of connection, when we meet the suffering in ourselves or in others, it naturally will develop into compassion. It can't but develop into compassion if it is that natural flow coming from metta, from kindly awareness, loving kindness. I like what Bhante Sangharakshita said about Karuna. Karuna is metta with a shadow cast over it. And I want to read something else that he said about compassion. When we begin to cultivate compassion, for example, we have to take whatever seed of it we can find within ourselves and help it to grow. As time goes by, our experience of it will deepen. And if our efforts to develop it are accompanied by a keen appetite for studying the Dharma and a willingness to bring our ideals into our everyday activity, we can come to experience a very pure, positive compassion, which is quite different from what we usually understand by the term. And that comes from, I probably would safely say, is my favorite book of Bante's, which is Living with Kindness. It's been my go-to book for at least a decade now. So what he's saying, which I think is very hopeful, is that when we cultivate compassion, we take whatever seed of it we find within ourselves. So the seed of compassion is already in all of us. We all know compassion already. We've all experienced it in its purest form. But very often we've experienced it in an unconscious way, in a spontaneous way that we haven't really thought about. So of course, bhavana means the cultivation of or the development of. So what we're trying to do in the Karuna bhavana is to consciously cultivate that which is already within us as a seed. And we're doing that with metta. Another significant thing I think that Bhante said was that in many ways there's only one Brahmavihara, and that's metta. And that when metta meet the other experiences in life, it transforms into the others. So it's the root, it's the core, it's where we begin, is with metta. But today we're focusing on when metta meets suffering or dukkha. Yesterday in the group that I was in, the discussion group, we were talking about metta and how it can be quite difficult sometimes when we come up against the suffering of others, that it can be overwhelming. And also that we can, if we're trying to be mettaful towards someone, to approach a certain situation from that place of metta, sometimes we can come up against the aversion from the other, which can often be in the form of unpleasant words or actions. So I wanted to unpack a little bit the distinction between when we're focusing on suffering, when we're focusing on dukkha, and what karuna or compassion is. So if we're focusing on the suffering of the world, simply focusing on it, which is not, it's very difficult not to do that. There is so much, particularly at the moment, so much suffering that we're aware of. We can get overwhelmed by that. We can become very, very sad by it. And what's happening there is that we're not actually moving into a state of karuna or compassion. We're actually contemplating dukkha. We're contemplating suffering, and we're going deeper into that contemplation of dukkha. And that's not wrong in and of itself, but it can, if we're not doing it with awareness, what it can do is that it can bring us into a negative mental state, an unpleasant mental state of sadness, despair, overwhelm. On the other hand, the contemplation of the suffering within ourselves and others can actually offer the basis for the cultivation of compassion. So what we're trying to do with Karuna Bhavana is we're trying to cultivate compassion by recognizing that there is suffering in the world. You may have come across that before, that there is suffering in the world. I'm sure you've heard of the Four Noble Truths. The truth of dukkha. And so by contemplating that, we can then move toward compassion. But we're contemplating dukkha from a place of metta, from a place of kindly awareness. And as we're cultivating Karuna, what's happening is that it's finding its expression in the wish for others to be free from suffering. In fact, it's the wish for all living beings to be free from suffering. And I'll say that again because it's very significant. It's the wish for all living beings to be free from suffering. Wish is significant. And what we're doing with that is that the mind is actually turning its attention toward the fact that there can be freedom from suffering. Again, you may have heard of that before, that there is freedom from suffering and a path that leads to freedom from suffering. I won't remind you where it's from. And if we can focus on the vision that there is freedom from suffering, what can happen is that we can move toward a more positive or pleasant mental state. We can actually move toward joy. Now, this might sound somewhat counterintuitive, that we're contemplating dukkha, and yet we can move toward a joyful state. I know that certainly at a time in my life, if you tried to tell me that, I certainly there would have been a few retorts and an opportunity for heavy debate as to whether that was true or not. Because certainly I had the view that we had to contemplate suffering and we had to really get down deep and dirty into that suffering so that we could understand the suffering of others and make the world better for everyone. And then I'd find my white horse and off I'd go on the crusade. But I always thought that I had to get in there to that horrible, unpleasant sensation that I would feel in the pit of my stomach. Whereas now, as a result of discovering the Dharma and the teachings, I understand that, in fact, by focusing on suffering, by focusing on dukkha, if I can do it with the recognition that there is freedom from suffering through the Dharma, that can bring me into a joyful state, which enables me to act in a much more constructive way in the world, in a much more efficient and effective and appropriate way in the world when I meet the situations that we all meet every day. We recognize sometimes that there's nothing we can do about suffering. And that can be a big one. I certainly, within my own life experience, I had to come to terms with the fact that there were aspects of my suffering that I was just going to have to learn to live with. The good old word acceptance, which I had a very strong aversion to. But it was that turning toward the recognition that there is suffering, but also that there is impermanence in conditioned existence. And so everything comes to an end. Even suffering can come to an end. So sometimes we can't change the situation of suffering in ourselves or in others. But what we can do is remind ourselves that this too will pass. That's an act of compassion in itself. If we're with somebody and there's nothing we can do to alleviate their suffering, by simply being with them, by witnessing, again, with the recognition of impermanence, we can become a positive influence in their circumstances. That's an act of compassion. And of course, compassion will turn to action in situations where it's necessary and appropriate. So there are times when what we need to do is get up and take action as appropriate. But we need to be aware to be able to, shall we say, figure out or to assess effectively which situation we're in and what we need to do in any given situation. So I suppose something else that struck me when I was looking into Karuna in preparation for the talk and into and just reflecting on it was this sense that the essential component of Karuna, the most essential part of compassion, is the concern for others to be relieved from suffering and affliction. So it's the concern or the wish for others. Action isn't always possible, but true compassion bears witness to dukkha, to suffering. And with this witnessing comes an understanding of what is possible. And sometimes all we can do is stand alongside the person and just be with them, bearing witness. And sometimes there's not even something to say. It's a silent bearing witness, just being present, just sitting. Other times it can be simple acts, but I'll go into that later. It can be very small, simple acts that you all do. I'm pretty sure of that. In fact, I've been at the receiving end of some of them, so I know you do them. Excuse me. I was talking to David. As some of you know, David is my husband and a mitra in the ordination process. And he's currently on what's called the Karuna appeal. So he's telephoning people, fundraising for projects in India. And I was saying the other day to him that I was preparing this talk and I was doing what I like to do, which is, I don't know where to begin. What'll I do? And he was saying, well, one of the leaders of the project was talking to them this week, and she was talking about how Karuna it's open and it's spacious, and she'd gone into a particular story of a situation where she accidentally knocked on the door and then saw the sign saying that this person didn't want any, I don't know, hawkers, beggars, whatever. There was a list anyway, and that if you knocked on the door, be prepared for this person's wrath. And at that moment, as she read the sign, having knocked on the door opened. And so she said, I'm sorry, I didn't see the sign before I knocked. And this person ranted and raved at her, as they do apparently. And all she did was she smiled and she tried to practice metta in this situation. And what the man said at the end was, he said, that's the kindest I've been to anyone who knocked on my front door. Now, from where she was standing, I don't think it was particularly kind to be at the receiving end of. But what she came away with was an understanding of the suffering that he must be in. If that's the way he feels anytime someone comes to the door, the sense of separation he must be feeling from others. Now, I'm putting words into her mouth now, but that sense of, to be in that mental state constantly where you want to open the door and have a rant at whatever poor soul is standing there, you must be in a pretty dark place to be like that. And so, of course, what was happening for her was that metta was evolving into Karuna, into compassion, very spontaneously. And one thing that she apparently says to all of the volunteers on the project is to remember that compassion, that Karuna it's open and it's spacious. So we're moving into an open, spacious place in our mind, in our heart, or our heart mind, as I like to say, that sense of chitta, heart mind. So we're moving into that openness. And from that open, spacious awareness, we're able to see more of the picture. We're able to see where this behavior might be coming from. And we may even be able to understand that it's coming from that deep, dark place of suffering. Very often what happens is that we get so caught up in the effect it's having on us that we shut down, and then we go into more negative mental states. And then we've cut ourselves off, not just from the other, but also from that open-hearted meta and everything else that comes with it. I can see people writing, so I'll pause for a moment. Sorry, I forgot to mention, I keep looking down because I have my memory joggers on the desk here beside me. So as well as being open, spacious, and allowing, again, we constantly remind ourselves that even suffering is impermanent. Just like all things, it is impermanent. All things change, all things come to an end. And although in this moment our suffering might feel very dark, very severe, very intense and unending, it will change in nature and quality. And that's one of the things that we explore in our mindfulness practices, is how even the unchanging aspects of our unpleasant experience actually do change and come to an end sooner or later in some varying degrees. But another thing about compassion is that it isn't complacent. So it doesn't just sit back, and although it's open and aware, it's not sitting back on its laurels and saying, yeah, everything just happens. I remember being horrified easily 20 years ago. I was working with a chap, and he himself and his partner had decided to dabble in some form of what they called Buddhism at the time. I didn't know very much about Buddhism back then. And wherever they'd been living, there was a cat in the garden, and there was a heat wave. And the long and the short of the story was that they thought that Buddhism meant that you just sat back and allowed everything to be as it is and not do anything to intervene. And anyway, the cat died as a result. So that was not metta, and that was not Karuna. In those situations, when we see suffering, yes, there is suffering all around us, but in the circumstances where we can bring about active change, then we do it. We step up and we do it, and we do it from that place of kindness. And that might mean speaking up. It might mean taking action. It might be doing things or saying things that in the short term feel unpleasant for ourselves and others. But if we're coming from that place of kindness, if we're coming from that heartfelt place of the best intention for the other to help alleviate their suffering in the long run, then we need to do it. As a nurse, that was something that you just had to do. You had to do all sorts of horrible things to people. But it was because ultimately you were trying to alleviate their suffering, their illness. I worked in theatre, and sometimes, I think about we'd have been put in jail if we'd done half of what we did in theatre outside on the street. But again, it was that we were doing this to alleviate suffering. We were doing this to enable someone. We weren't just sitting back and going, "Isn't that awful? I feel your pain." So yeah, I have another note here, and I'm saying this is more of the same, but I can't stress this enough. I think compassion doesn't lose perspective. It doesn't get brought down by failure or our perceived failure at relieving it. So it doesn't lose perspective. It stays in that open, spacious awareness. It doesn't get dragged down by feelings of sadness or overwhelm because we, me, myself, and I are perceiving that I have failed in alleviating or relieving it. We've brought self in there. We're selfing again. And we've actually begun to bring that separation between self and other in that process. But as well as that, it continuously, Karuna, compassion, is continuously longing for the alleviation of suffering of all beings. And I say all beings. I want to introduce some of the beings. We were introduced to, I was going to say Maitrikaya. Maitrikaya yesterday introduced the Buddha Maitreya to us, Maitreya. And he was talking about metta and the colors. So of course, when we come to compassion, we also have some great beings, some Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And one of them is Avalokiteshvara. And Avalokiteshvara is actually the symbolic, it's the myth of the order that we're in the Triratna order. And specifically Avalokiteshvara, who has 11 heads and 1,000 arms. And Avalokiteshvara is usually seen as being white in color. And of course, the 11 heads and 1,000 arms are symbolic of the heads are the ability to see in all directions. And the 1,000 arms are the ability to do what's needed to be done, wherever it's needed to be done, with whatever tools are needed to alleviate suffering in the world. And I like to imagine that I'm one of the arms of Avalokiteshvara as an order member. And that's part of my myth, the myth that I have now. Once upon a time, my myth was more of the probably Joan of Arc, where I was the lonely heroine that tried to save the world on my own. I found it very exhausting, and if I'm really honest, I actually burnt out eventually as a result. Whereas by becoming this arm of this great being of compassion, it feels more energizing and more possible, because I'm doing it with the connected action, with the connection and the support and the friendship of my fellow order members and members across the world and within the movement as well. And another being, she's actually a Buddha that I want to briefly introduce you to, is Tara. And usually there are actually 21 forms of Tara, but the two that we know most well would be green and white Tara. And apart from the obvious that they're both different colors, and I'm not going to go into the symbolism of the colors, they sit in different poses. And what's significant about white Tara is that she has 7 eyes. So she has the eyes where, we all have our eye sockets, but then she has an eye at the center of the forehead. She has an eye in the palm of each hand, and she has an eye in the sole of each foot. And she's sitting in meditative pose. And the symbolism of these eyes can be that she sees all suffering. She's not blind to it. She sees it, she's open to it. Green Tara is, Maitrikaya spoke yesterday about Amitabha, not Maitreya, sorry, Amitabha, and how Amitabha is his deity that he visualizes, the Buddha that he visualizes. The Buddha that I visualize and who influences my day-to-day life is Green Tara. And what really strikes me about her is, apart from her green color, which I could go on for the rest of probably the year about, is her posture. So she's sitting with her left leg drawn up in meditative pose, but her right leg is stepping down on another lotus. And that is where she is ready to step into the world, to take action, to alleviate suffering. Avalokiteshvara in some forms is also sits in similar pose. He also can be seen as stepping down into the world. I'm not going to say much more about them today because I will be talking about Tara later in the week. So these are symbolic ways of imagining compassion. And what's significant for me, particularly with Green Tara, is that difference in the way she sits. One leg is drawn up, one leg is stepping down into the world. And it's very important that, for us to enable us to be able to step out into the world, to alleviate suffering, to meet this suffering that's all around us, we need to be able to take care of ourselves, our mental states. We need to be able to meditate. I've come across in some of Análio's writing, that the Buddha, he didn't just go into the forest just to get time away from everyone, just for himself. It was actually an act of compassion. He would go into the forest and he would have recommend to his monks to take time out, to go into retreat as an act of compassion for all and for future generations. So firstly, it's a way of us recharging our batteries. It's a way of us just getting back into that place of perspective until we reach enlightenment anyway. And then that enables us to be more compassionate in the world, to be more merciful in the world. But it's also leading by example, because others see what it's like when we come back, how we are in the world when we come back. And that can encourage others by our very actions to move toward more skillful ways of being, and therefore away from certain aspects of suffering that we can bring on ourselves. So for the last few minutes, I've been talking rather broadly, and I sometimes think rather vaguely about Karuna and compassion. So how do we take it into our daily lives? How do each of you go out into the world and meet suffering with compassion? Well, as I said, we can start small. We can start by doing simple things like washing the dishes. There is a sutta where the Buddha talks about how if a monk comes home before the others, this is my words now, but if a monk gets home before others, that they clean up the food or they get the water and they do everything for the others coming back from the alms round, that they look out for each other, and they do this in silence if they're in silent retreat. So even those little simple things, if we were on retreat, maybe if someone's tired, and this again is something I've seen people doing, that somebody just takes over their place on the rota. We do these little simple acts all the time, but they are actually acts of compassion. We start small. Shantideva says that in the Bodhicharya Vitara in relation to generosity. Start small. I think it's something like, give your neighbor salt or sugar or something. So by even just washing the dishes, it's an act of compassion. By taking time out to go on retreat, within reason, that you're not leaving mayhem behind or something. But again, that can be an act of compassion. But we do need to be very, very careful, because as with the other Brahma Viharas, there are what we call near and far enemies. Far enemies are very obvious as to what they are. And in the case of compassion, it is cruelty. The near enemies are a little bit more difficult to see, because they feel more like the natural emotional response to suffering, but in fact they aren't. They're more we're actually just trying to they're an act of aversion, or a being a sense of aversion to suffering. So the two are, there's one, sentimental pity. And sentimental pity, if you've had it, if you've been at the receiving end of it, you'll know it. Because it's that sort of, they're there now. Listen, everything will be all right. Yeah, no, I understand. And when they're saying it to you, that they're completely disconnected. They're not really taking on board. They're not really seeing or hearing what you're experiencing. And it feels unpleasant, and it adds to the suffering really for us, doesn't it? At least that would be my experience, because I go into then on top of everything else that this person hasn't seen or heard me. And what's happening there is that we're just trying to almost ignore it. It's an act of aversion that if we don't get into, if we don't really see this person suffering, that well, then it'll go away. We'll be fine. But we're not actually connecting with that person. We're not in that open space of metta. Horrified anxiety is the other one. And horrified anxiety is that sense of overwhelm. I often think of a character from Dad's Army who, whenever things would go wrong, he'd run around frantically going, don't panic, don't panic. And he'd be running around panicking. So I often think of horrified anxiety as a wee bit like that. A very real example of it for me was many years ago, my daughter, when she was a child, she fell off a bicycle. She did a very nasty tumble and ended up with stitches on her face and a lot of injuries on her body. And I remember going into our local health food shop in a panic and wanting half the shop. I mean, when I think about the amount of things I put on the counter to try and make it better for her. And I was busy telling the chap who I knew what had happened. And I remember being in a frenzied state with this. And he very calmly, very gently, and very quietly said, in conscience, I can't sell you all of this. I will sell you this one item. And he did. And that action, first of all, his calmness and his kindness helped me come back out of that state of horrified anxiety that I was in. He was able to see the situation from that bigger perspective that I'm talking about. And in doing that, not only was he showing me kindness and compassion, but he was enabling me to learn from it through that example he was giving, just by his spontaneous action, by his spontaneous kindness and honesty and openness in the situation. And I do recognize that what I had done was gone into horrified anxiety, and what he was doing naturally was he was in that broader, more open place of what I would describe as Karuna, compassion. So what's happening with those enemies, those near enemies, is that we've lost perspective, we've lost connection with the other, and that's the hint. We'll know if we've moved into them because it's become more about me than the other person suffering. You know, that I want to get rid of this, you know, get this away from me, get this away from me. I don't want to know, or whatever. There'll be a texture of that. You'll feel it, you'll sense it if you can drop into the body and drop in and notice what's happening internally. And of course, the far enemy is cruelty. And cruelty, again, is something that you probably all go, well, I'm not cruel to anyone anymore. It's great. You know, I'm not cruel to animals. I'm not cruel to people. But actually, cruelty can be very, very subtle. Cruelty can take form in what we think and what we say. And it can be so subtle that, particularly, I know for myself, I can be my own worst critic, as those closest to me also know. And I can be quite vicious and scathing with myself in here when I'm analysing what I may have said or done or whatever. And it's not very skillful. And it certainly doesn't put me into very positive mental states. And so again, what I need to do is that I need to come back and I need to see the situation and what's going on with metta, and then Karuna will arise. So I don't know if you can relate to that, but that might be something worth bringing up in your discussion groups. You know, how do you do the near and the far enemies? So just to briefly finish, our daily lives, how we can bring Karuna in, first of all, by practicing metta constantly. I practiced metta for 2 years, day in, day out, as a particular practice after a row within my family. And I was struck about 1.5 years in when a relative did something, and I wanted to move into righteous indignation at how terrible this person was and how cruel they had been to my sister's ex-husband. And I went into this whole, and I suddenly realized that what was happening was that every time I tried to get angry and indignant about what he was doing, all that kept happening was that I kept seeing that he was coming from this place of deep suffering from his own childhood. And I couldn't get past that. So it was quite funny, because in many ways, my daily diligent practice of metta bhavana on the cushion was actually affecting me, even when I tried to be unskillful. It was quite, again, it was a real eye opener and quite transformative for me. Our practice of ethics can also help. So by living by the precepts, I'll actually finish with that. Our practice of ethics can, if we're living by the 5 precepts, we simply can't lose a sight of compassion. And this is from the Madhyama Agama. Sorry, let me try again. It is actually the Karajaya Jakaya Sutta. And this is an extract. Suppose there is a small boy or girl who since birth is able to dwell in the liberation of the mind through compassion. Later on, would he or she still perform unwholesome deeds of body, speech, or mind? The monks answered, certainly not, Blessed One. So actually that sutta goes on, it's for all of the Brahma Viharas. So if we're living a compassionate life, we cannot be unethical. If we are living an ethical life, we will naturally be compassionate. So there's something else for you to unpack in the groups, and I have gone over time at this stage, so I will finish there.